Oida. My daughter tried to murder me in the Sahara Desert, and it took me 3 months to decide whether to destroy her life or save it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. I'm Sarah Walsh, and this is the story of how I went from a broken woman left to die in the sand to the architect of my own family's complete and utter downfall. But it wasn't the way you might think. There were no screaming confrontations, no dramatic courtroom moments, at least not the ones that mattered. Instead, there was something far more deliberate, far more thorough. There was strategy, there was patience, and there was the slow, methodical dismantling of everything my daughter and her husband had built their entire con on. The assumption that I was just another elderly widow they could discard. I need to take you back to the beginning, to who I was before all of this happened, because that matters. I was a woman with a quiet life in Minnesota, and I'm not ashamed of that. My husband Robert and I had been married for 42 years. We met in college. He was studying accounting, I was studying art history, and we collided literally in the library stacks when he wasn't paying attention to where he was walking. He made me laugh that day, and he never really stopped. We built a life together, not a flashy one, but a real one. He was methodical with money, careful with our investments, strategic about our future. We didn't have children right away. We waited until we were ready, and then we had Madison. She was our only child, and yes, I suppose that meant we gave her attention, gave her love, maybe gave her too much of our attention sometimes. Parents do that. We think the world of our children, and we want them to think well of us. That's the fatal flaw, I think. That's the thing they count on. Robert passed away 5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. It was quick, which was a mercy, and it was devastating, which was inevitable. I was 62 years old, and suddenly I was 62 years old alone. We had built a comfortable life. I won't hide that. Robert's accounting firm had been successful. Our investments had been smart. When he died, I inherited $330 million. That number doesn't even feel real to me now. It feels like I was saying it about someone else's life. But yes, $330 million held in trusts, in accounts, in real estate, in blue chip stocks and bonds. Enough money to never worry about anything again. Enough money to insulate yourself from the world if you wanted to. Enough money that you'd think people would love you just because you existed. Madison took his death hard. I took it harder, but Madison was devastated in her own way. She was 31 years old, established in her career as a marketing executive, but she clung to me during those months after the funeral. She came to the house constantly. She held my hand. She told me I wasn't alone, that she was there for me, that we were family and family took care of each other. Then, about 8 months after Robert died, she introduced me to Tyler. Tyler was charming. I don't say that lightly. He was the kind of charming that made you feel like he was genuinely interested in who you were as a person. He asked about my art history background. He listened when I talked about Robert. He laughed at my jokes. He made eye contact. He made me feel seen in a way that, honestly, I had forgotten what that felt like after Robert's illness and death. He was a financial consultant, Madison told me. He helped manage wealth for high net worth individuals. He had an MBA from a good school. His family was old money from back east. He seemed solid. He seemed safe. Madison loved him, and that seemed to matter. It seemed like proof of something. They got engaged 18 months after they met. The wedding was beautiful. I paid for it. Of course I did. I was a widow with more money than I could spend in 1,000 lifetimes. I wanted to give them the life they deserved, the life they were clearly meant to have together. They moved into a beautiful home in Minneapolis, and I helped them with the down payment. Tyler started to become a fixture in my life. He'd call me to ask about my day. He'd invite me to dinners. He began to manage some of my finances, helping me organize things, he said, just making sure I wasn't being taken advantage of now that Robert wasn't there to handle things. It made sense. I was 64 years old, a widow, not particularly savvy about markets and investments. Tyler was patient and kind, and he genuinely seemed to want to help. I should have known. I think some part of me did know. But grief does strange things to you. Loneliness does strange things to you. When someone tells you they love you, when they show up consistently, when they seem to be woven into your life so seamlessly that you can't remember what it was like before they were there, you stop asking questions. You stop holding your guard up. You let yourself believe that maybe, just maybe, you deserve to be happy again. 2 years after Robert died, Madison and Tyler came to me with an idea. They wanted to take me on a trip. They wanted me to get away, to see the world, to experience something new and beautiful and transformative. They wanted to take me to Egypt. They had already planned it all out, researched it extensively, found the perfect company, the perfect itinerary. I remember Madison sitting in my living room, her eyes bright, telling me about Cairo and the pyramids and the Nile River. Tyler was scrolling through photos on his phone, showing me the temples, the museums, the tombs. It sounded magical. It sounded like exactly what I needed. And I wanted to spend time with my daughter. I missed her. Even though we lived in the same city, I felt like I was missing her somehow, like there was a distance between us that I couldn't quite name. So I said yes, and I made the arrangements, and we booked our flights, and 3 weeks later, the three of us were walking through the streets of Cairo. The first 2 days were wonderful. We toured the pyramids of Giza. We walked through the Egyptian Museum, and I stood for 20 minutes just staring at the mask of Tutankhamun, and Tyler stood beside me and asked me questions about the art and the history, and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. We had lunch on a rooftop overlooking the city as the sun was setting, and Madison reached over and squeezed my hand, and I thought, this is enough. This is more than enough. This is everything. On the third day, we took an organized tour out to some of the smaller pyramids and some desert sites. The tour company provided a guide, a driver, bottles of water, hats, sun protection. It was well organized and professional. We drove out into the desert, and it was breathtaking in a way I can't quite describe. The immensity of it, the emptiness of it, the sense that you're standing at the edge of something ancient and infinite. We were in a group of about 15 tourists, and everything felt safe and normal and exactly as it should be. That night, Tyler suggested we hire a private guide for the next day. He said there was a site that wasn't on the normal tourist route, something that most people didn't get to see, something special. He had researched it, and he'd found a guide who could take us. Madison was enthusiastic. I asked if it was safe, if it was legitimate, and Tyler said of course he had checked everything thoroughly, nothing to worry about. So the next morning, the three of us set out before dawn with a man named Rashid, who spoke English but not much of it, and we drove out into the desert in a Land Rover. The site we were going to was apparently an ancient temple that had been partially buried by sand, something archaeological but not particularly well known. It would take a few hours to get there, Rashid said. We had packed breakfast, lunch, water, sunscreen. Everything was prepared. I don't know exactly when I started to understand that something was wrong. There was no moment where it suddenly became clear. It was more like a slow creeping awareness, the way fog rolls in, and you don't notice it until you realize you can't see the landmarks you were using to orient yourself anymore. We had been driving for a couple of hours, and the landscape had become more and more barren, more and more monotonous. There were no other vehicles. There were no other people. And then Rashid pulled the Land Rover to a stop, turned off the engine, and said something to Tyler in Arabic. Madison and I were in the back seat. I was reading a book about ancient Egyptian funerary practices. Madison was looking at her phone, though I'm not sure how she had any signal out there. Tyler was in the front, and he turned around, and he looked at me, and his face had changed. The charming expression was gone. The interested, loving expression was gone. There was something else there, something that looked like cold calculation. He said, "We're here," and I asked what he meant. Where was here? Where was the temple? And he said, "We're going to leave you here for a few hours. We'll come back to get you this evening." I laughed. I actually laughed because it seemed like a joke, but Madison wasn't laughing. Madison was staring out the window, and her jaw was clenched, and she wouldn't look at me. I said something like, "What do you mean you're going to leave me here?" "I don't understand. What's going on?" And Tyler said, "Get out of the car." His voice was different. It was hard and flat and completely devoid of anything resembling warmth. I said, no, I wasn't getting out of the car. I wanted to know what was happening. And he reached around from the front seat and he grabbed my arm and he pulled, and I was suddenly stumbling out of the Land Rover into the heat. The door slammed shut. I remember the sound of it, this solid thunk that seemed to echo across the desert. I was standing in the sand and I was trying to understand what was happening, and Madison rolled down her window and she said, I'm sorry, Mom, but you need to stay here for a few hours. We'll come back for you. Just wait here. Don't walk around. Just stay where you are. I said, Madison, what is this? What is happening? Why are you doing this? And she said, Tyler will explain everything later. I'm sorry. And then she rolled up the window and the Land Rover started to move and they drove away. I stood in the desert and I watched them disappear into the heat shimmer on the horizon. And for several minutes, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I couldn't process what had just happened. I looked down at what I had with me. I was wearing khaki pants and a long-sleeved shirt and a hat and hiking boots, which I'm grateful for now, though at the time I didn't understand why I'd worn them. I had my purse, which had my phone, my wallet, my passport, my medications. I had the water bottle that was in the car, which was probably 3/4 full. I had nothing else. I turned around slowly, and I saw nothing but sand and sky in every direction. The sun was high overhead. It was probably around 10 o'clock in the morning. The temperature was somewhere in the low hundreds, and the heat was so intense that it seemed to have physical weight. I stood there, trying to think clearly, trying to figure out what was happening. Was this a test? Was this some kind of twisted, practical joke? Was Madison having a breakdown? Was Tyler some kind of psychopath who got off on terrifying elderly women? The answer was yes. To that last one, I would eventually learn. But in that moment, I didn't know that yet. In that moment, I was just trying to survive. I looked at my phone. No signal. I tried to call for help anyway, but the phone just spun and eventually gave up. I had a battery level of 75%, which was something. I had water, which was the most important thing. I had shelter from the sun if I stayed where I was or found high ground. I had my mind, which I needed to keep clear. I made a decision in that moment. Not a conscious decision, maybe something more instinctual than that, which was that I was going to survive this. Whatever this was, whatever they were doing, I was going to make it through. I walked to a slightly higher point of ground, and I sat down in the sand. I covered myself as much as I could with my long sleeves and my hat. I drank some water. I tried to think like the girl I had been before I became a wealthy widow, before I became someone's target. My father had been a hunter. He'd taken me into the woods when I was young. He'd taught me about finding direction, about conserving resources, about keeping your head when you're scared. I didn't know desert survival, but I knew survival. I knew that panic kills faster than thirst, and I knew that you have to assume people are coming back until you have absolute proof they're not. I waited. I drank water sparingly. I watched the sun move across the sky, and I tried to make sense of what had happened. At first, I thought Tyler was doing this, that Madison was a victim somehow, that she was being coerced or blackmailed. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. She had been texting him all morning, which I'd seen. She had known exactly where we were going. She had packed for this. She had known. My own daughter had driven me into the desert and left me there. By afternoon, I started to wonder if they were actually coming back. It was a different kind of fear, more abstract but somehow worse. If they weren't coming back, I had a bigger problem. I had maybe 2 liters of water. I had no food. I had no clear way to know which direction to go if I needed to move. I was 64 years old. I wasn't in bad shape, but I wasn't a trained survival expert either. Out here, at this time of year, a person could die of dehydration in 24 hours if they exerted themselves. If I moved around too much trying to find help, I could burn through my resources and die out here. So I made a decision. I would stay where I was. Rescue crews would find me. Someone had to know we were missing. The hotel knew we had gone out with a guide. Tourism authorities would eventually notice we hadn't returned. And in the meantime, I would conserve my water. I would stay as calm as I could, and I would survive. I was wrong about one thing, though. Madison and Tyler didn't come back. Not that day. Not that evening. When it started to get dark and there was no sign of the Land Rover, I understood what had happened. They had left me here to die. They had left their $330 million windfall to die in the desert, and they had gotten back in the vehicle, and they had driven away with no intention of ever returning. I want to tell you that I panicked. I want to tell you that I called out and cried and fell apart. In some ways, I did. There was a moment at dusk when I sat down in the sand and I sobbed, great heaving sobs that came from the deepest part of me. But I also sat down. I organized my thoughts. I drank a small amount of water, and I prepared for the night. The desert at night is cold, colder than I expected. I hadn't brought a blanket or a jacket beyond what I was already wearing. I dug out a shallow depression in the sand, and I tried to use my body heat to keep warm. I tried not to think about what would happen in the morning. I tried not to think about how many days I could survive like this. I tried not to think about the fact that my own daughter had done this to me. But I did survive. I survived the first night. And when the sun came up the next morning, I survived that too. It was on the second day that I saw the riders. They appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon, a man on a camel or maybe a horse, leading another camel. I stood up, and I waved, and I felt something like hope for the first time since Rashid had turned off the engine. The man approached, and I realized he was Bedouin, dressed in traditional clothing. He spoke Arabic and I spoke English, so communication was difficult, but we worked it out. His name was Hakim. He was out in the desert on some kind of business or journey. I never quite understood exactly what. But he took one look at me, sunburned and exhausted, and he knew I was in trouble. Hakim gave me water and food. He gave me a head covering and help to my feet. He took me on his camel to a settlement where there were other people, and we eventually made our way to a road where a truck picked us up. The truck driver eventually got me to Cairo, where I found the address of an archaeological team at a hotel. I walked in looking like something out of a nightmare, and a man named Dr. Andreas Meyer, an archaeologist from Germany, took one look at me and immediately arranged for me to see a doctor. I won't go into all the details of the medical exam, but I was dehydrated, sunburned, and in shock. I was also, thankfully, alive, and that's when I had to make a choice. I could report this to the Egyptian authorities, I could report it to Interpol, I could go to the American embassy and file a report of attempted murder. I could get on a plane and come home to Minnesota and go to the police there. I could do all the things a normal person would do. But I didn't. And I want to tell you exactly why I made that decision, because this is the moment the story turns into something else, something darker and more calculated. Because I realized in that hospital in Cairo, lying in a bed with IVs in both arms, that something about this didn't add up. My daughter and Tyler had access to my money. They had my trust. They could have found 1,000 ways to pressure me or convince me or manipulate me into giving them what they wanted. Why would they take this risk? Why would they try to kill me in such a messy, inefficient, easily traceable way? Why would they do this in Egypt, in a foreign country, where things could go wrong so easily? The answer was that something else was going on. Something bigger, something I didn't understand yet. So I called a lawyer, not in Egypt, but back in Minnesota. I called the lawyer who had drawn up Robert's will and all our trust documents. His name was David Chen. I told him that I'd had an accident in Egypt, that I was recovering, but that I needed him to explain something to me. I needed him to tell me exactly what would happen to my money if I died. I needed to know every detail of every trust, every stipulation, every contingency. And David told me something that made my blood go cold. Robert's will contained a clause that Madison didn't know about. It was something Robert had put in there years and years ago, before Tyler even existed in our lives. The clause stated that if Madison or anyone acting in concert with Madison attempted to harm me or steal from my estate or do anything illegal related to my money, she would be completely disinherited. She would get nothing. Everything would go to charity. Everything. $330 million would go to scholarship funds and cancer research and homeless shelters, and Madison would get $1. $1. a symbolic repudiation. In other words, the murder plot would have netted them absolutely nothing. It was a perfect, complete failure before it even started. That's when I understood what kind of people I was dealing with. They were desperate enough to commit murder, but they were not smart enough to look carefully at the will before they did it. They were greedy and entitled, and they had based their entire plan on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. And now they were in Egypt, probably panicking because they'd left me out in the desert, unsure if I was actually dead, scared that I would come back and press charges. I got on a plane back to Minneapolis, I went to my doctor, I filed a report with the FBI, and then I did something that would define the next 3 months of my life. I started to investigate Tyler, not officially. Officially, I was a grieving woman trying to understand why her family had betrayed her. But unofficially, I was something else. I was a woman with unlimited resources and absolutely nothing left to lose, and I was going to understand exactly how deep this went. It turns out that Tyler wasn't Tyler. Or rather, Tyler was one of his names. His real name was Marcus Thompson, and he had been running the same con on wealthy, older women for 7 years. He had married at least 4 times. There were at least a dozen women who had experienced financial fraud at his hands. He had stolen somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.8 million across those years. Some of those women were still alive. Some of them had died under suspicious circumstances. And all of them had the same story: a charming man, careful courtship, marriage, gradual access to their finances, and then either a sudden emergency that required large sums of money, or in some cases, more direct methods of theft and fraud.